GWE students. I'm going to finish up the sexual selection lecture today, and what I'll do is I'll have a few iClicker questions at the beginning of class to test you on some of this material. And then also just a reminder, there are no labs next week, but there will be class on Thursday. So we're going to finish up by talking about what are called the good genes and color resistance to parasites, and this was developed by Hamilton and Zook. And the idea here is fairly simple in that females choose males that have brighter coloration or more exaggerated traits because it's an indicator of their resistance to parasites. The basic idea is that males that have resistance to parasites are not battling these parasites. They're able to produce this costly male trait. It's energetically expensive to produce, whereas males that have are fighting parasites are not resistant, have less energy to devote to these sexually selected characters, and show a drabber coloration. So this is an example from a three-spined stickleback. These are common freshwater and marine fishes in the Pacific Northwest and actually all over the Northern Hemisphere. Males build nests that females come to visit, and then he mates with her inside these nests, and she keeps her offspring in there. Okay, so here in an example, we're showing males over here that are a drabber coloration. Here's a much brighter male with a redder coloration. And the basic take-home message is there's a real, if we look at each one of these graphs, B shows the relationship between color intensity. These are drabber males, these are bright red males. There's a strong relationship between the health index of a male and its color intensity, such that these males tend to be healthier, can produce that coloration, and it's believed to be directly related to the fact that these are resistant to parasites and are in healthier condition. And these males down in here, which are drabber, are more susceptible to parasites, fighting parasites, and unable to produce this colorful, costly trait. And the idea here is that females show a strong preference for males of brighter coloration. So these are the female preference, female choice for drab males, much higher preference for males with a brighter coloration. The idea is fairly simple, that females are choosing these males using a signal that is directly linked to sort of their good genes and their resistance to parasites. So it's not that she's not choosing males that are resistant to parasites, she's using this costly male trait as a signal of the indicator of the male quality. I'm not going to go into this experiment too much, but this basically when they filtered the light so that females couldn't distinguish between what were really red and really drab males, she couldn't distinguish them and showed no preference at all. But again, the take-home message is females choose males that are brighter because they're more resistant to parasites, and her sons inherit those high-quality genes to resistance. So one of the important things is that any of these models of female choice that are linked to genetic quality, the signal that females, or the trait or the signal that females are choosing, must be very costly produced so that low-quality males can't fake it, and only the high-quality males can produce this. And this is a fairly complicated graph, and I'll just try to break it down. On the y-axis is what's called fitness, cost, or benefit, and along here is tail length, ranging from smaller tails to bigger tails and more elaborate tails. Okay, let's first look at the black line. So this is the mating success due to tail length, and as we see, it's kind of a positive relationship between mating success and tail length, such that males with longer tails are preferred by females and have higher mating success. The other part of it is the cost curves for each of the males of different quality. So red is the cost function of producing a male, tail length of various length for a low quality male. The blue is for a medium quality male, and here's the fitness cost as a function of tail length for high quality males. The key point here is that each one of these points, what you can see is that right here, the fitness cost to a low quality male of even producing this small tail is much higher than especially the cost to the high quality male. And it becomes really obvious out in here. The cost of the low quality male to even produce a tail length of medium is so high that it's basically, they can't do it. It's just they don't have the resources. If they're highly parasitized, they cannot fake that signal. They don't have the resources necessary to produce that. Whereas down in here, let's just look at this. What you see, the cost of the high quality male is much lower they can actually produce this trait because they're not fighting off, say, infections and things like that. And they can easily, fitness cost goes up, but doesn't accelerate as quickly when you're a high quality male. And it turns out here is the optimal tail length that these males can produce, and it's much higher for those males that are of higher genetic quality or, for example, more resistant to parasite. The basic take-home message is these signals are honest indicators of genetic quality. Higher quality males can produce these longer tails, and females are therefore getting those males with, say, resistance genes. Their offspring will inherit those resistance genes, and that will be a direct benefit to her. Another model of female mate choice is what's called sensory bias, and it's kind of odd, and we're going to kind of use an example to talk about it. But basically what it says, there's really no immediate benefit to a female choosing a particular male, but the male signal, and she chooses this elaborate signal because it kind of taps into what's called a pre-existing bias in her auditory sensory system, for example, especially when if it's a call. It could be tapping into some sort of visual sensory system if it's some sort of coloration. But the basic idea is the male signal taps into a pre-existing bias in the sensory system. And then once that happens, you get the evolution of preference for a particular kind of trait. It can then escalate through various kinds of sexual selection. And we'll be talking about an example the best example is in a frog, a Tungara frog from Panama. And there's a group a genus of frogs in the neotropic Central and South America that have various components to call, two components to call, a whine and a chuck, and I'll be showing you a video of this. So let's talk about how Mike Ryan and a group of researchers at the University of Texas at Austin have been studying this for 20 years and what they've shown. So they're basically there are 7 species of these frogs, neotropical frogs, and at the tips of these trees, it's whether this species, the male, produces the chuck, and whether through female mate choice experiments, females prefer chucks or no chucks. And so this is the species that has been studied the most, but what you'll see is all 3 of these species in here, the males produce the chuck. None of the other species produce the chuck. So the production of chucks by males is hypothesized to have evolved in the common ancestor to all 3 species, and the blue coloration indicates that all of them now produce the chuck, and the chuck is hypothesized to evolve there. He then did a series of experiments with not too many, but these 3 species, and he basically set up these mate choice experiments where you put a speaker at one end where a chuck is being produced, and another one where just the whine is being produced. You put a female in the middle, and you look to see where she goes, to which speaker, and if she moves towards the speaker with the chuck, then there's a female preference for chuck, and you do this with multiple individuals. What he found is these 2 species, Pustulosis and Coloradorum, both actually the females prefer the chuck. This one doesn't. So this is kind of odd in that basically, and you probably have to do it in all these other species, but what you would assume, basically where you can map this is that the female preference for the chucks is hypothesized to evolve down here. So that in fact the female preference evolved prior to the production of the chuck, and this is what's called, this species shows it even though its males don't produce it, because there's something about the chuck that introduces there's a pre-existing sensory bias. Now the question is, why haven't they started producing the chuck? But we won't go into that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about these things. So it turns out female Tungara frogs, so this previously we were just talking about whether they produce the chuck or not, but it turns out these chucks have undergone exaggeration. So some males produce 1 chuck, 2 chucks, 3 chucks, or 4 chucks. So the most elaborate calling is where males can produce 4 chucks. And so I'm not going to go into all the details, but along here is the proportion of listeners choosing call with more chucks. For female frogs, they tend to prefer, there's strong female preference for males that produce a lot of chucks. There's no preference for males that produce very few numbers of chucks or just whines. Okay, so clearly they do that. So here's what they sound like. So again, these males are all calling in a pond. It's kind of like a lek. And females come to visit, and they can then choose which males to mate with, and they tend to prefer males with more chucks. You can hear that chuck right at the end. swine chucks. Okay, so females clearly prefer males with the complex calls, but somebody else does too. And bat predators are very common in the neotropics, and it turns out there's a species of frog-eating bat that shows a strong preference for the same thing that the female frogs do. And it turns out these bats show a strong preference and show much higher predation rates on male frogs that produce more chucks, probably because they're easier to locate. They may be signaling longer, but it turns out these male frogs that produce the elaborate chucks have an advantage in terms of sexual selection. They have higher mating success, but it comes at some cost in that they have much higher predation rates. So the question is, oftentimes that will lead to a balance. It still looks like that the average number of chucks produced in these is anywhere around 2 to 3, but there are some extravagant males, but they may be selected against and have lower lifespans and higher mortality rates, but that isn't entirely clear. But this is a nice example that shows that, in fact, traits are under selection by females and can get exaggerated, but it also can come at some survival costs because other things are tapping into that signal, and in this case, bats are preying upon them. The last thing we'll talk about is male-male competition by cuckoldry, and this is an example from bluegill sunfish, which are freshwater fish, pretty common throughout the northern hemisphere, and males employ a lot of different strategies to try to fertilize eggs from females. And we'll just primarily be talking about the parentals and sneakers. But parentals tend to they build nests that have shallow depressions in them. They're much brighter, they have coloration, they're highly territorial, and they invest a lot in these sort of sexually selected characters. Okay? Sneakers, on the other hand, employ a very different strategy. They tend to be much smaller. They're often younger individuals. They're less aggressive. And their strategy is, as the name implies, is sneakers, is they sneak in and deposit sperm in about 10 seconds. So when this male is mating with a female, they'll often sneak in. I'm not going to spend any time on talking about satellites. They do a different thing. They're rare, but they're female impersonators. And we're going to mostly look at parentals and sneakers. And so the idea here is this is the typical male mating strategy. Sneakers are often used as an alternative male strategy that smaller individuals and, perhaps more parasitized individuals use because they can't develop these characters. But they're still trying to get mating success, and they employ this alternative male mating strategy. So what's important to remember in these bluegill sunfish, when this female comes in to lay her eggs, what she's doing is they have external fertilization. So she's laying her eggs in here in the depression. That parental male obviously is trying to deposit his sperm on it and dealing with both satellite males and sneaker males. And what we're looking at is, what strategies do they employ after the eggs have been deposited and the sperm is now being deposited on these eggs. So this is what we call post-copulatory sexual selection. And what's kind of interesting is we're going to be looking at how long do the sperm live if you're on average for parental males versus sneaker males, and what's the sperm density of parental males and sneaker males. And let's just look at the sperm density first. What you'll notice is that what sneakers really do is in each ejaculate of sperm that they deposit, they produce a much higher sperm density than parentals. So basically they're only in there for short term. They're trying to maximize the number of sperm that they deposit per unit time. And so they produce these very dense sperm packets or sperm ejaculates. Okay, that comes at some cost though. Turns out these sneaker males, their sperm don't live as long. They have a much shorter longevity, and there are various reasons for that. But the parental males, even though they produce fewer sperm, the sperm density per ejaculate, their sperm tend to live much, much longer than the sneaker males. And it turns out what you'd really want to know is which of these two strategies is more successful at getting eggs fertilized. And it turns out that the parentals, because their sperm live longer, actually fertilize more eggs than the sneakers do in general. And that seems to be a better strategy. But these sneakers are basically, I guess, in some sense, making the best of a bad situation. And they're getting some mating success, they're fertilizing some eggs, and it's a fairly low-cost, low-risk adventure. Okay, so just a reminder, we'll have a few iClicker questions at the beginning of class on Thursday, and have a happy Mardi Gras.